Welcome to the Byrne-Wheeler Report. We're recording this on the 22nd of January. On today's episode, we have a lot of deals to discuss and very little product news. So we're going to start off by talking about CES and Nvidia's announcements and keynote. We'll then talk about Etched raising $500 million, Upscale AI raising $200 million at a unicorn valuation. OpenAI has talked about sourcing from Cerebras and has disclosed its revenue. And then Marvell recently acquired or announced it was going to acquire XCon. And then we're going to talk about a few other developments such as Sci5, the RISC-V core licensor, obtaining access to the Nvidia NVLink C2C interconnect, and Global Foundries acquiring the ARC business from Synopsys. So with that, Bob, how are you doing?
I'm good, Joe. Happy New Year. I think this is officially our first 2026 recording.
This is our first recording of the year. You know, I noticed that you posted something about NVIDIA's statements at CES, really highlighting that largely they are recapping disclosures that they had talked about at the previous GTC and perhaps some other venues. So what are some of your thoughts on what NVIDIA said?
Yeah, so it was largely rehash of what Jensen had presented at GTC in DC back in whenever that
was.
Yeah, I think it was October. So there wasn't really much new. It seems like maybe people weren't paying attention because there was a perception of some newness there, but really he had already revealed all of the Vera Rubin NVL 144 components. I mean, he did show the Spectrum X photonics switch on stage, so that was kind of new, just showing the CPO implementation for Ethernet. Co-packaged optics, that is. But the only actual kind of product disclosure was this new storage platform, which they called the Context Memory Storage Platform, which uses BlueField-4 as basically the processing element in the storage platform. So,
yeah,
you know, it was shown as sort of part of the pod, but realistically, there's no reason it actually needs to be in the same row with the compute racks because this is RDMA based. It's not like it's super low latency access to the storage. So anyway, it's interesting that NVIDIA is launching a storage platform specific to sort of inference applications, but I don't think it moves the needle much in terms of the overall Vera Rubin platform.
I did note, and at the CES discussion, and maybe I just missed it earlier, they gave some performance figures, and you know they can be a little hard to interpret. They talked a lot about how, say, inference efficiency, you know, cost efficiency or power efficiency is improving 10x. And they issued some like raw teraflop claims. I think they say they got like NVFP4 throughput goes up 5x for inference and 3.5x for training, which it's curious that there's a disparity there, and have some ideas about what that's about. Do you recall them giving that kind of this kind of figures before?
No, I think the 5x number was new, but then subsequently they announced that they were able to boost the inference throughput on the Blackwell platform by 2x using NVFP. So it's not clear if it's really 5x or if it's really 2.5x, because the software, of course, is always making significant performance improvements.
Right. I mean, I think there's something, I think I saw it on the register, that one thing that they're doing is, so they often quote with sparsity, so they're counting flops that don't happen as if they happen. So, and they have a 2-to-1 structured sparsity advantage. So I think that could be what's on the training side. And then they have another compression approach that applies only to inference that's giving them an additional gain. So I think there could be some of that. And then they did mention that they're doing collectives in the NVLink switch. Had they disclosed that before?
Well, so they added basically the Sharp offload engine back in
Right.
NVLink 4, but it hadn't actually been enabled in software, and
Okay.
so I think the software has been kind of catching up. They had done Sharp in the InfiniBand switches,
Right.
but they hadn't actually implemented it in the NVLink switch as far as the software was concerned. So it's not new in the hardware, but it may be new
Okay.
from a software support perspective.
Newly enabled, right. And assuming their customers can use that, that's sort of like free, flops available to them that wouldn't be on the GPU.
Correct. Yep.
And then they've also, the efficiency, power efficiency, and some of the like real world throughput should increase with the bigger HBM capacity that Rubin brings to the table. And perhaps the Vera Rubin DRAM size has increased as well. So I think that there are a variety of factors that can take place, and they don't make it easy to draw comparisons. But I will put up some charts, and as we speak here, so on their website, NVIDIA talks about like Kimi K2, and they have some charts with the relative performance on Rubin versus Blackwell. And for a given token rate and number of users, how kind of in the middle of the band its performance has gone up a lot. My impression on this is that they're turning more attention toward inference and addressing a lot of the issues there, whether it's OpEx in the sense of power or like total system throughput, meaning performance. And I think that's reflecting how, as these AI tools become used more, we've got more people running inference as a ratio compared to the amount of training being done. So it's not to say there isn't a lot of training being done, but there's a lot more inference.
Yeah, and suddenly everybody cares about tokenomics, right? And so I think that's kind of the new metric. So the other interesting revelation was when Jensen had a Q&A session with equity analysts after the keynote. He was asked about the Grok license deal or acquihire or however you want to describe it. And he actually gave some clues as to where they see the value in the Grok architecture. And it's really about low latency inference and the kind of emerging need for very low latency inference. When asked about sort of how much of the market that represented, he just posited that maybe that would be sort of 10% of the serviceable market that would have this low latency requirement.
That's interesting to be that low because, from a user experience perspective, you want things to flow at a certain rate when, you're interacting with an online tools. I mean, maybe the reason why it's so low is that they're bringing down the effective end user perceived latency with Rubin and other developments. They're bringing it down in the common case, but there'll always be this leading edge 10% that needs even more.
Yeah, and I think as we discussed in the special episode with Mike, that at least in the existing Grok architecture, the memory limitations mean you can't run the largest models, right? So they have to run some smaller variants of the models, and maybe that also limits the addressable market.
Right. Yeah, that could be. This is sort of a tangent here, but at CES was the grand launch of Intel Panther Lake, which, as other recent PC processors, has integrated AI engine. And, as much as people are using AI in their daily lives, it's still seems to be pretty much cloud-based. And, I think that's one of two big headwinds for the PC industry in the coming years. Is one being there's really been a lack of need or benefit from having local AI that's been implemented. And two, in the short run, PCs have just gone up in price by 25% because the DRAM situation. All right, so Etched, also in the news, there were reports that Etched had raised $500 million. I wrote up something about Etched and their Sohu product on my site, xpu.pub, in 2024. I'll put a link to it in the show notes here. The story is that the two Harvard students had this realization that you could do data center scale AI processing a lot more efficiently with something other than a GPU architecture. They dropped out and formed a company. But there's very little that's been disclosed about this company.
Except that the design is specifically targeted at transformers, right?
Yeah, and the initial comments from 2024, it sounded rather brittle. My article starts with a quote saying if the industry moves away from transformers, then, we're in trouble, is what
We're
the
hosed, I think,
said.
was the quote.
The hosed, right. I mean, they're not the first to realize that if you were to start from a clean sheet, that a GPU probably isn't the best way to do a lot of these tasks. But there have been a lot of other AI companies whose architectures were too brittle. They were too oriented around CNNs, for example. Early transformers relied a lot on vector by matrix operations, and then later ones realized we can do some tricks and pack them together so that pack the vectors together essentially, and like other kind of compromises to do more matrix by matrix operations. If they had bet on this matrix by vector really strongly, and the industry shifted away from that, that would be another example of how the bet wouldn't pay off. I'd color me skeptical. There are just a lot of these companies pursuing data center, AI acceleration, and even Grok was they were acquired for a healthy price, but if it weren't for that, they weren't exactly a booming business.
Correct. I mean, we still can't really make sense of the value of that deal. So
yeah, we don't really know anything. If you go to their website, it's just a picture of the people at the company and the golden retriever. So looks like a fun place to work. But I should add, the people in the picture aren't like college age. It's sort of like a normal Silicon Valley companies. They're people with experience there. You just don't get to Harvard dropouts and create, a reticle limited, design and expect it to go anywhere.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. We would expect there to be increasing specialization, and as we see the shift to inference, but as you say, I mean, the danger is that the models change so quickly that it could essentially obsolete the architecture by the time they have first silicon. And I mean, with most startups, first silicon actually doesn't get you there, and you usually need a second generation before you actually see a revenue ramp.
Yes. And then the other thing is they're facing a Red Queen problem. It's one thing to say in 2024, we're going to come out with something that's going to kick the butt of Nvidia Hopper. Well, we're on Rubin, and, Nvidia's not standing still. They're not just making bigger chips, they are improving their throughput and their efficiency. So, those 10x or more gains that you're counting on, setting aside any optimism that applied at the beginning, those gains are going to be a lot smaller by the time you get your first or second generation out.
Yeah, it's the typical rear view mirror comparison. And as you say, NVIDIA is a moving target. And at CES, Jensen did make the point of announcing that Rubin was in full production, which I think caused a little bit of confusion, right? So it doesn't mean a pull-in in the schedule. They're still planning to ship the full NVL144 platform, the Vera Rubin platform, in second half. But, it does take time to actually get from Rubin silicon to a rack scale platform, right? And so that's sort of the 2-quarter delay, more or less, to get the actual Vera Rubin platforms out.
Yeah, I mean, these are very complex products. Just the assembly of the system and the shipping of the system is going to take a while.
And he also made the point that they actually did 6 new chips in this generation. So it's not just Rubin, they've got 6 chips to get to production.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also the other issues. The reason why there are 6 chips is that we've gone from, here's a single chip to you could put 8, and you could put 8 of them down to you're going to need some kind of interconnect to get them to work together, to here's how you make a rack and you'll need some other interfaces, to okay, here's the full rack scale solution, here's how you're going to scale it up. And you start breaking it down and you realize, 6 chips, that kind of makes sense. That's what you need to do to compete and meet the market needs. Okay, another news item on our list was Upscale AI raising $200 million and getting a juicy valuation. Now, I am not familiar with Upscale AI. What were they before and what are they doing now?
So Upscale AI is a spin-off of a crypto ASIC company called Auradine. And so they split off a team from Auradine. They spun out in kind of the middle of 2025 with about 100 people at that time. So the CEO, Byrne-Wheeler, I think he was CTO at Auradine, and now he's running Upscale AI. And the focus is basically on AI networking. And then at OCP, they made sort of a very high-level architecture announcement of something called Skyhammer, which is a scale-up switch architecture. And they talked very broadly about supporting both UA-Link and scale-up Ethernet, but they haven't really disclosed any details. In fact, the announcement was so high level, it was hard to understand what they were actually
but not as high level as what Edge.
Well, maybe not. I think at the core, Upscale AI is developing scale-up switch silicon, and so they raised $200 million in this recent round, which brings their total funding to $300 million, and they've reached a unicorn valuation. They're off to a fast start here into a market that remains relatively wide open. I mean, Astera Labs is there with sort of PCIe-based switches for scale-up, and then Broadcom, of course, has their Ethernet switches that are being used for scale-up. But the market for UA-Link in particular is still open, and that Astera Labs won't have a product soon. So the question is really whether Upscale AI can deliver fast enough to compete with whoever else is out there. I would have expected that Marvell would be more or less in lockstep with Astera, but then shockingly, Marvell just acquired this very small company called XCon, which developed a CXL switch, which is kind of surprising because Marvell has been working on their own internal switch architectures, and so I'm not really clear on why they had to go spend $500 million on somebody else's design. The one thing they did get from XCon, I think, is a faster time to revenue because XCon already had designs, they had silicon, they had designs, and so they probably get to revenue faster that way.
Right, and that was sort of true of Celestial in that, when they announced that acquisition, it looked pretty expensive, and then they disclosed, like, hey, look, there are orders on the books here, and when you look at them, you're like, okay, now I can see why they got to such a valuation. It's possible that there was enough customer traction for XCon that, and maybe the customer just felt more comfortable, with buying from a larger supplier like Marvell. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that would absolutely help a great deal. XCon is a very small startup, and so I think they should get sort of immediate design win traction just by being a part of Marvell. But the part that left me scratching my head is why Marvell didn't have this product internally.
Yes, exactly.
So not clear.
It's hard to know. We'll never know, at least on sort of an official basis, right?
Yeah, we'll never know what's happened to Marvell's internal development.
Although, I mean, there is, if we go back to Upscale and their switching capabilities, right? Some of those founders can trace their way back to Marvell, can they not?
Well, Innovium in particular, which Marvell acquired. Right. Yes.
Right.
And then there's some Juniper ASIC folks there as well. So
yeah. And going back to the XCon, it's not just a CXL switch. Don't they have a hybrid switch where you can run PCI traffic or CXL traffic over it?
Yeah, correct. I mean, it is essentially a PCI Express switch underneath, and so
because CXL and PCI are, they have some common underpinnings.
Correct. I mean, the CXL is essentially PCIe based at the physical layer, and anyway, it's heavily leveraged from PCIe at the lower layers. I think one thing that happened is that CXL development kind of got put on the back burner when the AI moment happened and everybody shifted their focus to accelerators and AI, and CXL was more sort of CPU-centric, host-centric, and kind of got put on the back burner a bit. So maybe that it's finally getting real traction, and this is a way for Marvell to kind of catch up with the market, that had sort of been in a delay loop as everybody had shifted their focus.
Right. Okay. And then I'm looking at our agenda here. Oh, okay. The next thing on our agenda is, OpenAI announced that it would be sourcing systems from Cerebras. And they also gave some indications what their revenue has been. What are your thoughts on the Cerebras deal and any details there?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it seems like OpenAI is working with anybody and everybody that can provide any compute, right? So, I mean, there's the AMD deal, there's a Cerebras deal, I think it's sort of the scarcity of capacity that is driving these kinds of deals where, you get capacity wherever you can get it. And again, there may be some level of specialization here, right? Where maybe if you're big enough and you have the resources, you can leverage different architectures for different workloads. I don't know if that's the case here, but, that would certainly
make
make
sense because Cerebras has their... they claim a lot of it, a lot of the pricing claims are based on the service that they offer versus, the selling price of their hardware. But they can kind of control the tokens per dollar. They can control the denominator as well as the numerator. But because it's a wafer scale integration, they can really reduce a lot of the latencies and have and be a better fit for more interactive AI applications.
Yeah, I mean, the other interesting news that came out of the World Economic Forum in Davos this week is that there were interviews both with OpenAI and with Anthropic, and Anthropic has been saying, hey, our revenue stream is all enterprise. By contrast, OpenAI is all consumer based, but then OpenAI came out and said, well, not quite.
Not quite, yeah.
We're about 60% consumer, 40% enterprise, I think was the split. Anthropic, I think, said, well, we're 70% enterprise, 30% consumer, or something like that. So
yeah, but it's also worth keeping in mind that OpenAI has a free tier that a lot of consumers use. They also are going to introduce like an $8 tier. That'll also be for consumers. I mean, we're chip guys, but I think when we look at the businesses, it makes sense to have a diversified customer base, and traction amongst individuals can translate into traction within enterprises who will be willing to spend more money, and perhaps vice versa.
Yeah, and so, I mean, going back to the Cerebras deal, you can imagine that maybe there are some more enterprise-focused kind of workloads or applications that OpenAI could address there.
Right. And in terms of revenue, although they disclosed it this year, they marked the 2025 as an estimate. They're talking about $20 billion. So that's a lot more than folks had been supposing, and it's a significant amount.
Yeah, and I think Anthropic said they had hit a $9 billion run rate at the end of last year. Bloomberg reported that, I think.
Yeah, and that's run rate, so that's not $9 billion for the year, but rather $9 billion
Correct.
Times whatever. Is that a 1 month or a 1 quarter rate or whatever? So it's going to be a lot less for the whole year. Unfortunately for OpenAI, and I'm a little puzzled why they'd show this. They showed that revenue was tracking the deployed compute capacity. And from my perspective, that's a bad thing because it indicates they're really not getting leverage off their investment. You really want it to be nonlinear. So for every incremental dollar of cost, you get a multiple on the revenue side, and for that multiple to increase, such as tokenomics in the current environment. Okay, next on our list here, so there was an announcement that RISC-V supplier Sci5 was getting access to NVLink, specifically the chip-to-chip interconnect. But again, I don't have too many details about this. Do you, Bob?
Yeah, Joe, I read the same press release you read. And I mean, I think the key point that I wanted to bring out is that this is really about the chip-to-chip version of NVLink, right? That wasn't in the press release. But when you talk about the coherent interconnect between the CPU and the GPU, that's the C2C version of NVLink. So that was the key point. And I mean, the real question is, what is the RISC-V play in the CPU side of an AI or an AI server node, essentially, right? And I don't think we haven't seen products yet that would fit that.
No, we haven't. Nor has anybody really talked about that. People, the big hyperscalers who are doing their own CPUs, they've been using ARM, and when they've licensed NVLink Fusion again for the CPU to NPU or GPU interconnect, it's that C2C.
Yep.
I would say Sci5, though, they've got, several years ago, they announced a relatively high-end CPU, the P870. I'm not aware of any devices using it, but certainly Sci5 has done things at the high end, and they have a whole spectrum of cores. It's possible that they have a licensee out there doing something, and they drove this, or we just don't know. It could just be groundwork for future opportunities, and it doesn't really cost them anything to have some pre-integration.
Yeah, and there's probably also sort of a geopolitical angle here in that RISC-V has had a lot of traction in China, but then, of course, the whole situation with GPU exports to China remains kind of in limbo at this point. So, if Nvidia is betting that they're going to be able to kind of crack that and eventually sell the H200 or whatever it might be in China, then there could be an angle there.
There could be. And, Sci5 cores are also inside some custom NPUs, so who knows? It's conceivable that there's ARM-based CPU side and something like, NVIDIA's licensing NVLink for use with AWS Trainium. So you could think of a device comparable to Trainium that has some RISC-V cores on it. So it's, again, it's more of a curiosity right now for me than, anything I can comment until I have more facts.
Yeah, the key question is, why would NVIDIA want to support this, right? And there's probably something there that we're not just isn't obvious at this point.
Right. Okay, and then wrapping up the discussion, Global Foundries and Synopsys announced that Synopsys is spinning off its ARC processor core business to Global Foundries. There's a RISC-V angle here, and that ARC transitioned from a proprietary instruction set to RISC-V, so ARC-V being the newer RISC-V compatible ones. So that's the other item in the news, and that's pending customary closing conditions.
Yeah, so why do you think Synopsys decided to get out of that business?
Yeah, so there are two sides of any transaction, right? Synopsys wanted to exit and Global Foundries wanted to pick it up. I think from Synopsys' side is they gave some reasons in their press release, and they want to focus on more of the interface and foundation IP, and frankly, a configurable processor is quite a bit different. It requires more customer hand-holding. It requires ongoing R&D. Even if they're not, pushing performance limits, they're still developing new products, DSPs and AI accelerators based on it. So I think it just doesn't line up with what Synopsys wants to do now. And that may have been the case for a while. That just doesn't line up with the make once, sell many times that software and foundation IP business is in.
Yeah, customization does make it difficult to scale, right? It's if you're ending up having to do customization, you can't scale the number of designs very easily without committing a lot of resources. So that makes sense. And then I guess from the Global Foundry side, I seem to recall they acquired some MIPS IP.
Yes. Well, they acquired the MIPS company. So and MIPS had transitioned to RISC-V as well. So they already had a pure CPU IP company.
So then how do the ARC and MIPS pieces fit together in your mind?
Well, there are a couple ways. First of all, MIPS was probably subscale from a personnel standpoint. In their comments to me and other comments I've seen, they talked about how they valued the team. It's not one of those deals where they're looking to minimize the number of human resources acquired. That's a big component. A lot of the use of RISC-V has been around customization, and that aligns with the the standard ARC story, which has been around their configurable IP. Traditionally, Synopsys has been in the market with an NPU based on the IP for a while, whereas MIPS is just getting into that. It would really accelerate their presence with kind of these edge AI accelerators. So, I mean, it's just interesting that Global Foundries is getting into the IP business and supporting this kind of customization and so forth. But given that they've done that, this kind of makes sense to do a little consolidation, especially around configurable IP, and especially given that ARC has a pretty good presence in the automotive and industrial markets, which happen to be the ones where Global Foundries targets, leading edge lithography, looking to distinguish their manufacturing processes differently.
Yeah, definitely more specialized foundry, and I think MIPS had a multi-threaded design also.
Yeah, MIPS has emphasized the multi-threading. Even though they had safety certified cores, Mobileye was their big customer, but I don't think they had the same traction as ARC in automotive. So it's a consolidation play where they bulk up, and the combination should be stronger, and the alignment with RISC-V, I think, makes a lot of sense. It's an interesting play. We'll see where Global Foundries can take this IP business.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to watch.
Okay. Well, with that, Bob, is there anything else for us to talk about today?
I think that catches us up on the recent news. As we said, most of it's kind of been deal-driven. Looking forward to some new products coming, and we'll have, GTC in March. And so I think, things should get pretty interesting here over the next couple of months.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us today. And for more of our analysis, go to our respective websites, wheelersnetwork.com and xpu.pub. And please click the bell icon, because you never know when we'll post another video. Be well.
It's all about the pendients, baby.